Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Culkin's Trubergy, also known as Baron of Sidious. In today's Storyteller's Corner, we present to you the following short story, as written and presented by yours truly. The following tale is entitled 1 Mile Shoes. With only the glow of control panel monitors and keyboard lighting strips to illuminate most of the chamber, the man tasked with checking on the status of the project drew the attention of the technicians, not so much by the light of his old metal lighter's flame, so much as the sound of it clinking open, and the fact that he was lighting a cigarette in the building. One of the supervisory agents approached from the dark blue metal wall that she'd been leaning against, her clipboard-like tablet held in both hands against herself in the timid fashion reminiscent of academics and animated programs. She pulled one hand off of her tablet, long enough to make a fist in front of her mouth, and coughed meaningfully into it as she came up alongside him. "We don't allow smoking in here," she said with as much authority as she could muster. "If I put this out now, after I just lit it, I'm going to use your eyeball as an ashtray," the man replied in a tone that had about as much warmth and humanity as an ice sculpture. The supervisor flinched back from him half a step and swallowed hard. The man in the black suit took a long drag, tapped ashes right on the floor, exhaled away from the supervisor woman. "The previous iterations have all been marked as failures. This one doesn't appear to be doing any better." He took another long drag, exhaled, and turned his head to look at her, his half-lidded eyes fixed on her. "How long has it been running?" She started, pulling the tablet away from herself to poke around on the touchscreen and navigate for an answer. 6 days, Mr. "You can call me Mr. Gray," the suit said, turning his head back to look down over the 2 rows of programmers and technicians, all of whom were rhythmically clacking and typing away on their individual consoles. "Mr. Gray, all of the previous iterations were given at least 2 weeks to run before they were run through shutdown. We haven't had a chance to even identify the principal errors in this version." "You won't be getting that chance either. Central has been keeping tabs from the interior," Mr. Gray said, taking one last pull on his cigarette and then dropping it, spent, to the metal floor, crushing it out with one firm press of his wingtip down onto it. "They know it's a bust. The original concept designer also wants to take another stab at it, and your contract with him was only for 3 years. There's no way he has the kind of resources we do to work on this," the supervisor insisted, trying to look for some way to keep the project going. "You don't have the resources you think you do, Miss Martin," Gray said flatly, which caused her to blink rapidly at him. She had never seen this man before, so how did he know her name? "You're funded well, but that funding comes from the taxpayers. Those taxpayers do not owe you an endless supply of their money." "Our budget isn't subject to audit." "Not to the public, no, but it is subject to oversight by the people I answer directly to, Miss Martin," Gray said, turning bodily to face her, tucking his hands into his pants pockets. "You have 2 hours to shut all this down and collate all of the data into a flash drive or 2. I'll be back then." He started to turn toward the door of the chamber, and she took a step toward him, one hand gently pressing on his shoulder. "That's not much time to get everything transferred and ready, Mr. Gray," she said, letting a little tremble into her voice. He didn't even turn his head as he said his final word on the matter. "When I return in 2 hours, you will give me the flash drives with the gathered data, or I will terminate everyone in this room, starting with you," he said. "Moreover, this will not be a personal choice, but merely the conclusion of carrying out contingency orders. I will be back. Mr. Gray left the room then, and Miss Martin started issuing out hasty, panicked orders to immediately start producing reports to centralize into one console terminal and shut down all work on the program. She didn't want to die just yet. "3 years, and many miles away from that darkened room, Leonard Spratz pumped his fist in triumph as he pulled the earpod out of his left ear. He turned toward the 6 programmers standing in a horseshoe behind his swivel chair and beamed up at them. "It worked, guys. We're in business." Uproarious hoots and hollers of cheer came from all 6 of his colleagues, and Leonard shot up out of his chair. "Okay, Billy, go unhook our volunteers from their gear and make sure that they get fully checked out over at the clinic." "They signed waivers, didn't they?" one of the other programmers, Jim Trask, inquired. "That doesn't mean we're okay with them having some delayed side effects," Leonard replied. "Hop to it, guys. Let's get to breaking down the data." Billy took the volunteers down the street to a walk-in medical clinic, where they were each given clean bills of health, and then proceeded together toward a nearby cafe. When Billy reported back to Leonard that the volunteers seemed inclined to spend even more time together, having never even met before that morning, the engineer smiled like the cat who'd gotten the proverbial canary. "Lingering empathy response," he said with a nod. "That only works further in our favor, Billy. Strap in for the next couple of years, my man. We're going to be rich beyond our wildest dreams." "What are we going to call it, though?" Billy asked. Leonard thought about this for a moment, pulling out one of the old physical notebooks he kept in his primary workstation desk in the rented office space. He flipped through it, a collection of old axioms and truisms that he had collected and written down over the years, and when he landed on the one that had inspired this entire endeavor, he dog-eared the page, handing the notebook over to Billy. Billy read it and just raised an eyebrow at him. "I don't get it." "1 Mile Shoe, Billy. We're going to call it the 1 Mile Shoe." Part 2. Adoption of the technology had been slow going for the first few years, and even after improvements were implemented, with various augmentation pieces offered for a deeper, fuller experience, the cost of the equipment remains something of a barrier for most people. For some, comparisons to cautionary tales like The Matrix, Kilobyte, and Ready Player One caused skepticism and hesitation. Yet, in 2041, as Leonard Spratz and his 1 Mile Shoe program came online as an optional augmentation service to the field of experiential simulation, something changed. People who used simulation services for things like trying to see what it was like to play in a game of professional-level sports or engage in an in-field military combat scenario started to notice a change when they selected one of the 1 Mile Shoe extensions. For them, it wasn't just a simulation or close approximation anymore. To quote more than a few of the early adopters of the extension, it was like actually being there and feeling what that soldier felt. The fear, the adrenaline, it was just so intense. By 2042, 1 Mile Shoe became its own separate service, offering the world access to, quote, a whole new level of empathy, of understanding one another. Spratz's company even adopted the old adage as its tagline. To truly understand someone, you need to walk a mile in their shoes. Or maybe just one, as in 1 Mile Shoe. Register today and join the emotion revolution. By January of 2043, 1 Mile Shoe had over 30 million users registered, with interface headsets in their homes, in the United States alone. "It hasn't been great," Sarah groused, picking desultorily at her Cobb salad. She took the chance to peer up briefly at Candace, who sat with her own fork poised above her matching lunch, one eyebrow raised, waiting patiently for Sarah to clarify. Though Candace was in an entirely different specialization from Sarah as a nurse practitioner, she could read the psychologist's hesitation just as well as if she had also joined Sarah in that line of medical practice. Okay, it's been a goddamn bloodbath, Candy. I've lost 5 clients in the last 6 months, all to what amounts to a glorified chimera of a social media site blended with a VR video game. Disruptive technologies always make things difficult at first, Candace replied with a shrug. She finally took a bite of her food, chewed thoughtfully, and chased it down with a sip of her soft drink. While Clara's was a fine establishment and offered plenty of wines or beers with meals, Candace had only an hour for lunch to visit with Sarah before she had to be back at the hospital in the southern Seattle outskirts. Look at how bad the SpaceX rockets fizzled out in the early days. And now we've got a residential space station 15 to 20 years away from being completed in Mars's orbit. Sarah gave her friend a dissatisfied glower at this. This is hardly the same thing. If this keeps up, my entire field of expertise is going to be reduced down to a handful of legitimate practitioners and the medical psychiatrists. Psychology will be entirely subsumed by a handful of programs and interface devices. Sarah pushed her half-eaten salad aside, unable to bring herself now to even finish it. Frankly, I'm wondering if the clients I've lost are going to come running back to me 6 months from now with some whole new set of problems caused by some glitch that 1 Mile's programmers didn't foresee, and I won't have the faintest clue how to help them. Have you heard of or read anything about problems yet? Candace asked, genuinely interested. We've had a few folks come get treated for injuries from malfunctioning hardware interfaces, burned fingertips, sores around the contact pads on the temples, stuff like that. No, nothing I've heard of just yet, Sarah admitted, though the notion darkly intrigued her. To be honest, my skepticism about the whole thing is based on vapor, Candy. I've never tested the service myself. Can I take that for you? The waitress asked as she scooted up to their table. Sarah gave the young lady a courteous smile and nod, inwardly smirking at her. Just Ian's type, I'll bet, she thought uncharitably, thinking about her ex-husband. Their marriage had imploded in on itself for a combination of reasons, though Ian assured Sarah that it was entirely her fault, while Sarah returned the favor. Oftentimes these unpleasantries were exchanged both privately over the phone and in court during their official hearings. There hadn't been many of those, given that Sarah had, at the time, far out-earned Ian, and he had no interest in trying to divvy up their earthly possessions beyond retrieving his clothes, television, laptop, and tablet device. There had only been the question of whether or not he'd wanted to seek any sort of alimony. Watching the waitress flounce away, Sarah thought back on Ian's exact response to the judge when she had asked about that. I don't need or want her money, Your Honor, he had said, glowering across the family courtroom aisle at Sarah. I put her through school, sure, but I make a good enough living to get by just fine on my own. All I want from her now is to take my name off the condo title and out of her phone's contacts list. Government being government, of course, this hadn't been exactly entirely satisfactory to the court, which had required by statute, by state, that Sarah make a certain minimal buyout offer to Ian in exchange for releasing any and all claim to ownership of the condo that they lived in at the Elliott Bay Towers. The court had collected its blood dividend in sales fees and taxes, of course, but since that day, Sarah had only heard from Ian twice in the 3 years since they had walked in opposite directions after descending the courthouse steps, she to her Mercedes, he to his utility van, filled with its plumber's tools. Earth to Sarah, Candace was saying, snapping her fingers in front of Sarah's face. You kind of blanked out there for a minute, Sarah. I was just saying I've got to get back to the hospital. Oh, right. Sorry, Sarah replied, grabbing the check and putting her debit card on the little platter, then holding it out to her side so that their waitress would catch sight of it and come to collect. You run along, hon. Thanks for this, though. Did you want to do it again in a couple of days? I have a full booking tomorrow and Thursday, but only 2 couples on Friday, so I should be able to get free around noon. That sounds good. But Friday, let's do Vinny's instead. I've been good all week. I think I've earned the carbs of a good Italian meal. The family's Sicilian, actually, but all right, Sarah replied, missing the small sigh and roll of the eyes that Candace replied with before quickly turning and hustling away back to work. Had she seen it, her mind would have invariably gone back to another Ianism, his tendency in the last year of their marriage to accuse her of being a, quote, insufferable know-it-all, constantly correcting everybody. But her thoughts were turned toward her ex-husband anyhow, and as the waitress snatched up the little tray with her card and the bill on it, she cycled through her phone's contacts list. Ian Hawkes had been able to get the court to agree to getting him off the title of the condo, but couldn't get his name out of her phone. She clicked the call button and put the phone to her ear. When the call connected after only one ring, she began her side of the conversation by saying, "Before you start yelling, I have a proposal for you." Ian Hawkes paced back and forth in the living room of the condo behind the lovely three-seat couch that Sarah had purchased shortly after his departure, to replace the sickly green and red striped monstrosity that he had insisted on hanging on to over the 6 years of their marriage. It had been a wedding present from his father, and as a kind of peace offering, all was said and done with the divorce, she had reached out to ask if he still wanted it. A pair of gruff-looking, sweaty, and altogether too fragrant gentlemen had come by the condo an hour later to retrieve it, and it had been gone from her sight forevermore, for which she was eternally grateful. A similarly built pair of men had brought the new Ashley Keating couch 2 days later. Ian finally paused and leaned one thick, powerful hand on the back of the Keating piece, eyeballing Sarah critically as she faced him in her Weems armchair, angled askew from the center of the living room, and toward the front door of the condo, generally. "What's your angle with this, Sarah?" the plumber who had been her beau at one time inquired evenly. Ian was a well-built man, though his midsection was beginning to show the signs of an early middle-age paunch. Still, despite her disdain for his knuckle-dragging mentality and worldviews, Sarah could not deny that he still possessed a certain base, masculine appeal. When they had met, while she'd been in her 3rd year at university, and she and her roommate were at a hopeless loss to get their landlord to come rectify the situation with their shower and toilet, she had found his practicality and handiness admirable. She hadn't known then that his manual and mechanical skills were a thin veneer, covering for an acute lack of deeper intellectual curiosity or capacity, a fact sadly learned over the course of their marriage. Even now, he seemed to not grasp what she was asking of him. "I mean, what do you get out of it?" "As I've explained, Ian, I want to get a better idea of how you saw things so much differently than I did, and this seems like an ideal opportunity," Sarah replied, embellishing rather heavily. What she wanted was an excuse to utilize one of One Mile Shoe's one-stop centers, little storefronts one could find in just about any city or suburb of decent size. The one-stop centers allowed for people to either test run the service for themselves before making a commitment to subscribe to the service and purchase one of the interface setups, or for people to anonymously donate an emotional experience for users to freely utilize on a whim. This way, neither of us has to sign up for the service or buy their devices, and perhaps I'll come away with a better understanding of people like you." "People like you," he snarled, shaking his head, folding his arms over his chest. That right there," he began, huffing wordlessly. He half turned toward the condo door and paused, seeming to come to a sort of realization. He turned and faced his ex-wife once more, bringing his hands slowly down to his hips, and he nodded. "Okay, you know what? Maybe you're right. This might be good for you." He pulled out his phone and tapped on it a few times, squinting at the screen. "We've got a big install next week starting on Wednesday, but I could probably make the day before work. Looks like my guys have most of the other jobs covered that day. How long do these things usually take, do you know?" From everything I've read, about an hour for the experience retrieval and calibration, and then an hour for the recipient to run through if it isn't overly complex, she replied, pausing to sip her tea. You wouldn't necessarily have to stick around while I partake of my part. Ian nodded, tapping away on his phone. Okay, I've got it set in my calendar. Message me with the address to meet you at and a time Tuesday, preferably afternoon. With that settled, Ian Hawkes made his way out of her condo, to the elevator, and then down toward the street level of the Elliott Bay Towers, leaving Sarah to wonder what had so abruptly changed his mind. Part 3. The reception area of the one-stop center she'd selected put Sarah in mind of any number of medical clinics or doctors' offices she had visited over the span of her life, with a couple of notable exceptions. For starters, there was no clear plastic divider between the receptionist at the front desk and the clients coming into the small front vestibule, like one normally found at clinics. Secondly, there was only one receptionist here, rather than 2 or 3 with their own little cubicle partitions at the entry desk. Lastly, rather than being given a form to fill out, she and Ian had both been handed computer tablets and asked to answer the questionnaires on screen, the first 10 questions of which had nothing to do with physical medical conditions or concerns, but seemed more like personality-type assessment inquiries. Sarah had not only utilized such tools in her own practice as a psychologist, but she had helped create several such assessment guidelines for various think tanks and organizations over the years. Scrolling down on the tablet, however, she was surprised to find that it abruptly ended at 20 overall questions. Hardly seems thorough enough, she mused. Ian was already returning his tablet to the receptionist when Sarah got up with hers, bringing it to the desk and handing it over to the middle-aged woman on the other side of the desk. When Sarah sat back down in one of the 6 seats arranged near the walls of the reception area, she watched as the receptionist fiddled with their tablets and maneuvered around on her own terminal. After a couple of minutes, the door to the right side of the desk opened, and a short, bespectacled blob of a man, smiling cheerfully at them over his goatee and mustache, gave Ian and Sarah a short wave. He was dressed like an office worker in pale khakis and a plain black button shirt with a blood-red tie, looking every bit the technical sort, to Sarah's mind. "Hello there, folks," he said, ambling over toward Sarah with one pudgy hand overstretched. As he drew near, Sarah could just make out the shimmer of interactive display text scrolling into view on the interior of his glasses lenses. "I'm Gene, and I'm going to be your coordinator for today's session," he said, pumping her hand once, then offering the same quick, firm handshake to Ian. The text on the left lens scrolled up swiftly, and he nodded. "So, this is a single experience exchange today, it looks like, right?" "That's correct, Gene," Sarah answered, sliding her left foot slightly forward and shifting her weight just a touch, imposing herself just a hair in front of Ian. "My ex-husband here has often remarked that I just don't see things from his point of view, and I thought it might be a good idea to try to rectify that." Gene replied with a soft smile, one that showed no teeth, but which formed cherubic little dimples in his cheeks. Sarah took a liking to Gene quickly. "Well then, this sounds like an ideal entry-level experience for you with 1-mile shoes, Sarah. Follow me back, folks." Gene pivoted on his heels, and Sarah and Ian followed him through the door into a wide hallway, with several closed doors on either side. When they reached the second-to-last door on the left, Gene turned around just past it and motioned for them to head within. Inside the room there stood a long wooden table, atop which sat 2 laptop-style consoles, several wires running from them to what looked like action sports helmets. The helmets, Sarah observed, had some kind of neon green netting on their undersides, the lines terminating in little silver contact diodes. "Please, each of you, have a seat," Gene said, coming into the room and shutting the door behind himself. As Sarah sat across from Ian, she looked over to the corner of the room, where Gene had his own little wheeled laptop desk, upon which sat a black workstation console, the screen glowing up at him as he swooped around to it. The coordinator tapped and clacked rapidly on his keyboard, and he smiled at them once more, reaching up and tapping the right arm of his glasses. So, we'll start with a few more questions before I hook you up to the interface helmet, Ian. What do you do for a living? I run a plumbing company, Ian Hawks replied evenly. It's honest work. And much appreciated. Believe you me, Jean said. And Sarah, what do you do for work? Sarah had initially considered lying if this came up, but given that Ian would leap on the chance to call her out publicly, she opted for honesty. I'm a behavioral psychologist, she answered. So I imagine you've had some reservations about the efficacy of the technology, Jean said, giving her a shrewd but still friendly look. It's understandable. We've had a lot of skeptics from your line of work, Miss Hawks, and I'll be honest with you, even after trying it for themselves, they don't always come around to our view, he said with a shrug. But from what I understand, we've managed to make about 70% of them decide that we've got something really special here. Sarah couldn't help but be impressed with that statistic. There were plenty of charismatic movements that couldn't claim that sort of level of success. Then again, he's not showing me any studies or printouts. He could be pulling that number out of his ass. It took only a few seconds, looking at the coordinator, to cast that suspicion aside. She didn't detect any of the shiftiness that she'd been trained to spot in someone attempting subterfuge or deception. No, Jean genuinely seemed to believe in the benefits of 1 Mile Shoe. But we haven't begun the process yet, so if you have any last-moment reservations, I'm more than understand if you'd like to cancel the entire process on your end. Wait, what do you mean on your end? Ian asked, tilting his head slightly to one side. Wouldn't that negate this whole appointment if she did that? No, actually. You see, Ian, may I call you Ian? The plumber pooched his lips and nodded, rolling one hand in a go-on gesture of magnanimity. You see, Ian, users of our system are always free to upload memories and experiences for others to utilize at their leisure, and we offer varying levels of compensation to contributors of our miles-long archive, depending on the nature and attachment to privacy for the contributor of that emotional memory experience. Some folks, for instance, may have a deeply fond recollection of their senior prom in high school, but because they engaged in somewhat mischievous behavior that evening, they may place a high priority on not including certain specific moments from that overall memory. In cases like that, we'll allow the contributor to have certain sections of those memories edited out and made unavailable for users to experience for themselves. A question comes in for me here, Jean, Sarah interjected, one finger raised demurely. We know that memory is not perfectly reliable, that it tends to carry a certain amount of one's own current bias and understanding to sort of muddle details or alter them. How does that affect the memory experiences used by 1 Mile? Well, Sarah, and that's an excellent question. One should always bear in mind that what we offer here at 1 Mile Shoe isn't an exact recreation of another person's memories and experiences, but rather the chance to connect with their mindset and emotional responses and feelings of those moments. This is one of the few instances in the broad field of technology where feelings matter more than facts, you see. He typed away on his console for a moment, then stepped over toward the Hawkses. But that's precisely why various courts have denied submission of our archived experiences to be used in any legal proceedings. The experiences aren't what they deem purely objective because they're predicated upon the individual's perceptions of an event. Sarah tried to formulate a follow-up question to this, but it was her ex-husband who surprised her with his own succinct translation. So it's not what happened. It's what do you think happened and how did it make you feel in the moment, Ian said. Jean snapped his fingers and pointed at him in response. Exactly that, Ian. Well put. Now, you indicated out front that you're the one whose experiences we're going to be sharing, right, Ian? And you indicated on your tablet that you wanted this to just be a one-time access directly to Sarah, correct? That's right. And, Gene said, stringing it out while he backpedaled to double-check his console. 3 separate experiences, about 5 minutes each, right? That's right. Gene nodded and came around to Ian's side of the long table, taking up the connection helmet and pulling the neon green wires so that they draped loosely, fitting the contraption on over Ian's head gingerly. Now, I'm going to punch in a little countdown command here on your console, Ian, Gene said, reaching just past the plumber to tap a few keys on the console in front of him. Now, I want you to close your eyes and concentrate on these 3 experiences, all right? In about a minute, you're going to feel a little sting, a light one, on either side of your head. That's nothing to worry about. It's just the data feedback diodes activating. After you feel the sting, you should relive those experiences as if they're actively happening, as you remember them, though it won't be in real time. We've managed to compress the time down significantly since first introducing the initial build of the program. A minute later, Ian twitched slightly as the diodes activated, and the netting draped over the sides in front of his head shone and faded, the helmet itself emitting a dull humming noise. After another minute, the hum died down, and the wires ceased shining. Ian's eyes fluttered open, and he reached up to either side of his head, slowly lifting the helmet off. Is it over? How long was that? Only about a minute, Sarah said, somewhat flummoxed. She had read from several sources that the process took much longer than this, but she then considered what Gene had just said to them before Ian's recording process, that this was no longer the initial build of the 1 Mile Shoe program. How long did it feel like, though? Honestly, about half an hour, all totaled, it felt like, Ian responded, reaching one hand up to rub at his forehead. Is a headache a common side effect, Gene? The coordinator brought a small red pill and a glass of water over to the table, just as Ian finished asking. Sometimes, yes. We've found that tends to happen with folks who don't use stimulants of any sort routinely. I assume you don't even drink coffee all that much, do you, Ian? Ian shook his head in the negative, taking the painkiller and downing it quickly with the offered water. Now, you are free to depart at this time if you'd like, or you can stick around to speak with Sarah afterward to talk over her reactions to your experience. I would, but I've got a project starting tomorrow that I want to make sure is all squared up before my crew gets started, Ian said, rising from his seat. If she wants to talk to me after, she knows how to get in touch, he added, not even looking in Sarah's direction before excusing himself from the small room. Gene came around to Sarah and helped her put the helmet and its netting on, and he leaned over to look her in the eyes with his hand hovering over her command console. Are you ready, Miss Hawks? He asked gently. She nodded. Now just remember, whatever these experiences show you, they aren't what was. They are what he experienced. Okay? Sarah nodded again, closed her eyes, and prepared to see things from Ian's point of view. The sting came on her temples, and the world went truly blank. Part 4. Ian reclined on the couch, his hands tingling with the discomfort that had become part of his expected routine for several days after a day of following behind his newer guys in the field and fixing the botch jobs that invariably led to customers asking for either refunds or a more experienced man to come redo the job, but do it right. There was always a mix of aggravation and pride that came with these follow-ups. Aggravation that one of his people messed up the job in the first place, but pride in his own continued abilities as a man of his trade. Sure, his would never become a huge company, not even on a regional scale or level, but Hawks Home Plumbing was one of the city of Seattle's most respected small-scale outfits. More than this, though, Ian took pride in knowing that each time one of his people decided to move on to another, bigger company, they were a lock for that position, because his people knew their shit, and moreover, The bigger companies knew that. He took these guys on, many of whom had never even known the difference between a drain line or a feed line, who couldn't tell from the age of a building if its pipes should be mostly PVC or copper. And by the time they had worked for Ian for about 12 to 18 months, they could easily handle their business. Cracking his knuckles, he grinned, thinking back on the little tete-a-tete he'd had with Sammy, the 20-something kid whose work he had just gotten home from having to go patch up, a sit-down he'd arranged to have at the shop before making his way to the Elliott Bay Towers parking ramp. "You can't use a part taken off from one job as a replacement on another, Sammy," Ian had grumbled, holding out the warped petcock he had just removed from someone's toilet tank. "This thing wasn't just worn down, see?" Using a pair of tweezers, he peeled the shaft open just a hair to show that it was, in fact, cracked. "You've got to look closer at these things. I know it's a pain in the ass to go down to the van and get a new part, then haul it all the way back up when you're doing an apartment job. But guess what? That's the nature of the business, kid." Sammy, head hung down, muttered something unintelligible. "What?" "I said, am I fired?" Ian scoffed, planting his hands on his hips. "No, kid, you're not fired. But you're also not doing any solo gigs for the next 2 weeks." Ian would rearrange the schedule for their next couple of weeks' workloads, but for the time being, he just wanted to relax on his couch at home and allow his mind to drift. He snagged the remote off of the nearby coffee table, turned to a mindless action flick on Netflix, and settled in to let his aches and pains naturally subside. It might have worked, too, but for the condo's front door opening, and summarily half-slamming shut behind his head. "Really, Ian, I already don't like the look of that couch. Could you please not put your dirty boots up on the cushions?" Sarah snarled behind him. Ian felt his shoulders tense up painfully, and he dragged his legs down, sitting up on the couch. He turned his head to watch her hang up her coat in a huff, glowering at him as she marched through the center of the living room, on her way to the shelves just outside of the kitchen, where she kept several bottles of wine. "How was your day, hon?" he asked, trying to engage his wife in conversation. He had tried to be interested in her work, but she often gave him only vagaries about the client's sessions. It made sense, of course. He understood the concept of patient confidentiality. But the way she usually spoke, it came across as if she was annoyed with his inquiring at all, as if he didn't comprehend the need for discretion on her part as a psychologist. It hadn't been this bad back when she'd first gotten her credentials, after college and her clinical residency. Back then, she'd been so enthusiastic about her work, she'd almost violated that very same said principle when talking to him about her days. But now she spoke to him like he wouldn't have the foggiest clue where to begin contemplating the challenges of the work that she did with people. She underestimated him at every turn, and he could feel it in the way she spoke to and looked at him. Like right now, he thought, sipping from his beer while she poured herself half a glass of wine. She thinks I'm just some dumb schlub who's good with his hands. "I'm running out of options for one of my couples," she began with a sigh, coming over and sitting in her favored Weems armchair, kitty-corner to him on the couch. "There's obviously things I can't dig into with you for ethical and legal reasons. Suffice to say that the husband is not engaging fully in the process, and the wife is running out of patience for his reticence." "Maybe he just doesn't want to say the wrong thing," Ian offered. God knows that's where I'm coming from most of the time, he thought. You know, steady on as she goes kind of thing. Sarah gave him a half-lidded, sardonic glare. "Why agree to go to couples therapy if you think things are just fine, Ian? Doesn't that perspective kind of defeat the whole purpose?" she quipped with a sneer. She flapped her free hand toward him, a gesture that made him want to throw one of the pillows on the couch at her head. Never mind. The room faded to black around Ian then, and Sarah, having seen, heard, felt and observed the inner monologue of her ex-husband in these last few minutes, felt herself catching her breath in that darkness. Holy God, she muttered aloud to herself. The world around her inner vision started to brighten once more, and she felt herself falling into Ian Hawkes' mind once more for another memory. When Sarah came fully back to consciousness, Jean gently pulling the helmet and its wires off of her head, she flexed her fingers rapidly. She had not only felt Ian's urge in those memories to ball his hands into tight fists of barely restrained control, but she had physically mimicked the impulse. Her nails had left deep indents on her palms, she saw. Seeing those brief moments in the late days of their failed marriage, and one from years earlier, when they had just been dating, she realized now how different the two of them were as people. From the word go, they had come from very different backgrounds and mindsets, something that she had concluded already halfway into their years together, but which was made undeniable by seeing several moments of Ian's life through his eyes instead of her own. "How do you feel, Sarah?" Jean asked softly. For a moment, Sarah couldn't think of how to respond, still trying to process what she had just gone through. She didn't want to indulge in any knee-jerk reactions, but she could not deny the truth of what she was feeling in that moment. "Indignant," she said after a few moments. "Seeing now how he felt in those moments, hearing his internal monologue in my own head, as if they were my thoughts," she said, shaking her head with a weighty sigh. "It was strange. Strange and unfair, Jean," she said, feeling more in control of herself now. "He never told me these things, not out loud. He never clarified the run of his mind to me." The coordinator walked over to his console and clacked a few keys on it, then rapidly typed something in before looking over to her. "Well, if you'd like, some of our one-time clients sometimes like to replay those same moments and feed them into our archives so that they can offer the initial user a chance later on to see them from the initial recipient's point of view," Jean offered. "Would you like to do that, just to have them recorded for later on? In the event you can't convince Ian to come back and look into them, you can always return yourself and request the memories be removed from the archives permanently." Sarah didn't need to think that over for long, responding instead by putting the helmet and wires back on her own head. "I'm ready when you are," she said firmly. Part 5. "Mr. Spratz?" Leonard looked up from his spot, lounging on the oversized beanbag chair in the corner of his office, reaching one hand up and tapping on the holographic pause button that froze the film he was watching, projected on the entire east wall of the otherwise darkened room. Over by the door stood one of the rail-thin women who worked on the third floor of the building, where his own office and those of most of the back-end engineers from 1 Mile Shoe kept their workstations. The money people were spread out throughout the floor just below him, and the marketing and advertising folks filled out the ground floor, the entire block structure appearing fairly nondescript and unassuming from the outside. The company's logo didn't even grace the front of the building. Instead, the only signage, stamped on the glass doors at the front and rear of the building, simply said, "Spratz & Company." The woman looked pale, and, even from where he sat, Leonard could detect the worry in her features. "There's a problem." "Come on in," he said, getting up off of the beanbag and walking over toward his desk, casually flicking through the holographic room controls hovering in front of him from the augmentation glove worn on his right hand. As he sat down, he pulled the glove off and carefully set it next to the console, putting his hand out to accept the tablet the young woman offered him. "Is everything on here?" "The initial report, yes. I was about to go call the Seattle office to get more details, if they have anything not in there, sir. Just call me back when you've read through and copied the report over. I'll add anything I find out when I can." Leonard nodded, and the woman flitted away as if her feet were on fire, and the rest of her would catch if she didn't move quickly. Leonard felt a sinking sensation in his guts. He never caused that reaction in people himself, so he assumed that her panic stemmed from the report now displayed on the tablet in his hands. He looked at the tablet and started reading. By the time he was finished, he well understood her trepidation. Setting the tablet aside after copying the report and sending to his own secure folder on his main console, Leonard pulled open the center-top drawer of his desk, reaching under an old pack of cigarettes for the card that he had tucked away several years earlier. As he looked at the card, he pulled out the old ashtray from his bottom right drawer, along with a lighter, lit one of the stale old smokes, and drew deep on it. His lungs remembered the routine, though he coughed like a champion on the first inhale. When the coughing fit was over, he pulled out his phone and dialed the number listed on it in plain typeface. When the line connected, he said, "Mr. Gray, this is Leonard Spratz. I think we have a problem." Sarah tried to pay better attention to Jimmy as he relayed the previous week's progress with the exercises she had suggested at the end of their last session, but her mind kept drifting to the odd events that had recently gripped the city and made it the focus of numerous strange conspiracy theories online. The most popular theory held that these people, mostly women, had been lured into becoming members of some kind of cult bent on murder and mayhem. Given Seattle's colorful history in the last quarter century as a hub of fringe socio-political activism, much of it including property destruction and violence, there certainly seemed to be lively enough soil to spawn such an idea. Another theory, one that Sarah had heard from one of her own clients, posited that the whole thing was the result of some kind of brainworm that had mutated after burrowing into people's minds, turning them into volatile maniacs bent on assault and murder. "So, it hasn't been the biggest step in progress, but it's getting better," Jimmy said with a nod. "I've even stopped flinching when I pass by the park and see people walking them." He chuckled nervously, snorted. "I'm not exactly going to go run off to the SPCA and adopt one, but I think I could tolerate being around one now for at least a couple of minutes if I had to." "That would indeed be a bit of a leap, Jimmy," Sarah replied, taking down a brief note on her yellow legal pad. "Now, for the next week, I want you to use some resources that might seem a little unconventional," she said, setting her legal pad aside and taking up an index card, which she had written down some things on before his session. She got up out of her comfortable red leather seat near the wall of the office and brought it over to Jimmy, who was sitting with his legs half tucked under himself on the client love seat, centered right in the middle of the room. This arrangement had been one of Sarah's longest-running and tightest-held concepts. "While you're here with me, you're the center of the session," she told her clients. Physically centering them seemed to be beneficial early on, and since it seemed to hold true, she didn't try adjusting the layout. "Those are the names on that card of several channels on VidShare, YouTube, and Rumble, all focused on dogs and the care and training thereof. By spending just an hour each day watching videos all about them, I think you'll benefit from not only learning about them, but I believe you'll see that they aren't all savage animals just waiting to take a chunk out of you." Jimmy thanked Sarah for the card, and a few minutes later, she was once more alone in her office. With no more remaining clients for the day, she made her way toward home, wondering if there would be any more of the strange assaults to hear about on the news by the time she settled in for a quiet evening with her latest book. Leonard paced back and forth, chewing on the edge of his thumb, pausing every few moments to look over at Mr. Gray and the programmer that the Fed, whatever branch of the government he belonged to precisely, had brought with him to the 1 Mile Shoe headquarters branch just outside of Austin, Texas. Gray, standing there in a three-piece suit, the same hue as his surname, looked every bit the part of Agent Smith from the classic sci-fi film The Matrix, if the actor had been aged forward perhaps 6 or 7 years from the time the movie had been shot. Hands folded together in front of his own waist, The agent's eyes remained hidden behind the dense black reflectorized lenses of his sunglasses. He could have been watching his programmer's console work or staring at Leonard, and the One Mile Shoe founder and CEO had no idea which idea was worse. After several minutes of typing and tapping, Gray's programmer let out a sigh, flapped his hands, and shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not seeing anything here out of the norm." Gray turned his head slightly and tilted his chin downward. "None of my auto runs are populating any suspicious code." "Mr. Spratz, I'm not any kind of computer expert, so I want you to explain to me like I'm any average guy who doesn't rely on that knowledge or skill set, okay?" Leonard, having ceased pacing, nodded. "What made you assume these incidents around Seattle have had anything to do with your technology?" "Every suspect in the recent spate of assaults and murders out there has been a registered, frequent user of our service," Leonard answered. "One of our data analysts was putting together names from the local area news services, and in every reported case, the only common tie beyond geographic proximity between the suspects was how frequently they logged into the service and accessed the archives database." Leonard ran his hands through his thinning hair and cleared his throat. "The problem is, we don't track what experiences our users access if they're registered with the service. We only do that for the one-stop centers." "Why specifically them?" Mr. Gray inquired. "We use those appointments as points of reference to try and convince people to purchase a home interface and register with the monthly service. It's marketing, essentially." "Actually, there should be one way to figure out what experiences they all accessed in your archives, if indeed they all happen to share one or two files among them," Gray's programmer said with a raised finger. "But we would need to access those users' home interfaces. Any equipment like this is bound to have a historical record of what files were accessed by the user, right?" Leonard snapped his fingers and nodded. "Sir?" "Let's go pay a visit to the good folks of Seattle," said Mr. Gray. Part 6. Sarah picked up her phone and, seeing that it was Candace trying to get hold of her, likely to inform her that she was on her way just then to the restaurant for their lunch get-together, she clicked accept right away. "Hey, Candy, are you running behind again?" She listened in, and at first she thought that perhaps there was some kind of interference on the line. She didn't hear Candace speaking, but only some kind of raspy, breathing-like noise that could have well been static. "Candy?" "I'm at my apartment right now, Sarah," Candace said shakily on her end of the line. I need you to come over. I need to talk to you, Sarah. Somewhere away from people. Away from men," she rasped, then hung up. Sarah held her phone away from her ear and stared at it, at the blank screen that just said, "Call ended." Dread gnawed at her stomach as she grabbed her purse and headed out of the restaurant to her car. She had never heard that tone from Candace, not in all the time that she'd known her. It was a quality of voice that spoke to something ferocious, something primal, with sheer, unadulterated malice threaded through it. Hate, Sarah thought, as she started driving toward Candace's place on the east side of the city. It was a voice of hate. When Candace opened her apartment door about 15 minutes later, Sarah noted the security chain restricting her view of the registered nurse as Candy squinted at her standing in the hallway. "It's just me, hon," Sarah said. The door eased shut and she heard the chain sliding out of position. When the door opened again, Candace reached out, snatched Sarah roughly by the wrist, and yanked her into the apartment, after which Candace put the chain back in place again. Sarah was about to whirl on her friend and demand to know what was going on with her, but she stood frozen in place, looking at Candace's living room, upon which the apartment door opened. The room looked like it had been host to a small tornado. What happened here? Sarah asked, finally turning around and looking squarely at her friend, who stood by the door with her back to it, holding herself and trembling faintly. Sarah saw that Candace had torn her nails, and her hands looked like they'd been used as cudgels, gashed and bloody, the skin torn with tiny lacerations. Candace shook her head, tears leaking down both cheeks. I don't know what all happened, Sarah, Candace croaked, but I know it has something to do with you and that thing, she said, pointing past Sarah. The psychologist woman turned and followed the straight line from where Candace stood pointing to the upturned coffee table in the middle of the room and the 1 Mile Shoe home interface console and helmet laying on the floor. Three days before Sarah went to Candace's apartment to check on her friend, Mr. Gray's flight touched down at SeaTac at approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, Pacific Standard Time. Accompanying him were two of his department's finest programmers/hackers, gentlemen whose everyday sort of tech geek aesthetic served as a wonderful cover for their commitment to their department's mission. As the trio approached inbound customs, one of Gray's fellow agents, assigned to the Seattle regional office, came up behind the customs agents and had a few muttered words with them. Blanching visibly, the customs agents waved Gray and his companions right through to join his fellow agent, who guided them wordlessly through the airport to the sidewalk reserved for local motorists to pick up incoming arrivals. The local agent pulled out a set of keys, handing them to Gray after unlocking a nondescript black SUV parked at the curb nearby, with the remote fob on the keyring. As Gray buckled himself in, he spoke with the programmers, also buckling themselves in. Mr. Sanders, contact the 7th Precinct and inform them that we are en route to inspect the device retrieved from the first incident. After that, the 12th Precinct to inform them that we'd like to see the ones retrieved from the second and third incidents. Mr. Hammers, likewise contact the departments in Bellevue and Redmond that we will be seeing them in the next 24 to 48 hours. The two programmers nodded, popped earbud devices into their ears, and started making their calls, while Mr. Gray started the SUV and made his way through the Seattle morning traffic. The agent had only been to this city a few times, and just like the previous visits, he found the hustle and bustle of the city's denizens even more irritating than he did in D.C., New York, or even Chicago. The peoples of those cities all seemed to be in a constant frenzy of movement because they were off to go do something, to chase after some sort of dream or make some essential appointment or duty. Here, though, much like in San Francisco, the movement of the masses seemed to have a performative nastiness to it, an ennui birthed from some unspoken resentment toward the very notion that people should be required to put forth effort in exchange for their needs to be met. Since around 2016, much of the Pacific Northwest and California, and parts of New Mexico, had become a breeding ground for this kind of anti-meritocratic, anti-normal person attitude, infused into nearly every facet of day-to-day life. Mr. Gray pulled into the public parking area in front of the 7th Precinct about 40 minutes after pulling away from the airport, and he put his sunglasses on as he climbed out of the vehicle. Sanders and Hammers followed behind him in slight flanking positions, the trio forming a V that could easily have put the casual observer in mind of a team of soldiers taking the first steps into a mission theater. Not far off the mark, really. When Mr. Gray passed into the cool, air-conditioned entryway of the 7th Precinct building, he stalked right up to the duty check-in desk, pulling out his ID badge and placing it gently down on the desk in front of the uniformed officer behind said desk. The officer plucked it up, eyes widening at it, and immediately offered it back with a slightly trembling hand. "My associate, Mr. Sanders, here called ahead," Gray said, not bothering to indicate which of the two programmers he was indicating. Right. My CEO gave me the heads up about 15 minutes ago. Follow me," the officer, his sleeve showing a sergeant's stripes, said quickly, guiding the trio of out-of-towners through a side door from the entryway, along a narrow corridor, and then around a corner to a solid blue steel door marked Evidence. The sergeant used a key to unlock the door and pushed it open, then stepped back. "Captain was very clear that you were to have the run of the room to yourselves. The case boxes you requested are right next to the log table there," he said with a nod of his head toward a large, flat wooden table in the middle of a sizable chamber full of shelving units with dated tags and organizer crates. 3 of the crates sat on the floor next to the table, labeled Clark, Rebecca, August 17th, 2043. "There anything else you gentlemen need from me?" "Several cans of whatever cola soft drink you have in your vending machines for these fine gentlemen, and bottled water for myself, please," Mr. Gray said, flapping one hand idly into the evidence room, signaling his colleagues to swoop in and start setting up their mobile work consoles and connecting them to the 1 Mile Shoe interface and console unit for analysis. "That will be all, Sergeant, and thank you." The sergeant scurried away like a terrified rabbit, returning a couple of minutes later with their beverages and setting them on the counter just to the left of the doorway, where several tools had been left out. Mr. Gray fetched Sanders and Hammers each a drink, which they cracked open and sipped from just before settling in to their task. The only sound in the room for almost an hour was the clacking of console keyboard buttons. Part 7. Several hours before Sarah Hawk's visit to a terrified, traumatized Candace's apartment, Mr. Gray dropped Hammers and Sanders off at the SeaTac airport, then punched in the address they had further tracked down for him into his phone's navigation program. The summary report of their findings upon digging into the files of the various suspects' 1 Mile Shoe interface units and consoles had revealed a great deal about the program's architecture over the last couple of days, and about what precisely had been happening in and around the Seattle area. According to the techs, someone had utilized one of the downtown Seattle one-stop centers to upload a couple of brief memory experiences for others to freely utilize for their own elucidation or experimentation. This had been something that Gray's employers had added to the initial build of the program when they had commandeered it from Leonard Spratz several years earlier. Under Spratz and his first programmer pals, the program had required direct connection between uploader and user. The person in question, according to 1 Mile Shoe's records, was a psychologist of the Seattle area by the name of Sarah Hawks. The experiences she had uploaded were arguments she had gotten into during the time of her failed marriage to a plumber by the name of Ian Hawks, a gruff but honest working man from what the summary report relayed. The emotional state experienced by Mrs. Hawks during those brief but ferocious conflicts were not only hostile, but they bordered on the combative or murderous. What the techs had discovered, however, was that there had been additional code layered into the experiences once they had been filed into the regional database. Per 1 Mile Shoe's internal network systems, single-time experiences could only be accessed by users who were regionally, geographically close to the one-stop centers, until such time as they gained notoriety, or what folks online used to call virality, in the early 2000s to 2020s. If an experience gained such popularity, the network would then share that uploaded experience to the broader network. A predatory little grin pulled at the corner of Mr. Gray's mouth. He could just imagine the sort of havoc this experience would have wrought if it had reached that level of critical success. However, he had his orders from his bosses, and he relayed that order then to the technicians, who burrowed their way into 1 Mile Shoe's central archives and scrubbed the Hawks upload and all traces of it. In its place, they planted what would appear to other analysts like a simple virus, one that had disrupted the neural pathways of the users who had run psychotic. It would provide a plausible enough explanation for the courts, law enforcement, and the media, and the broader public whom those entities would inform, and the people Mr. Gray worked for would issue an order from the government to shut down the entire program and its network while experts inspected it thoroughly. It would not, in the long run, ever be returned control of the technology to Spratz and his people. But Mr. Gray didn't concern himself with any of that for the time being. His work was not yet done. When Abigail flipped the light on right on the inside of the apartment entryway, she paused, detecting the faint scent of tobacco smoke lingering in the air. Moreover, just a few feet ahead, the light from her small kitchen was on, and she heard the metal clink of an old-fashioned lighter flicking to life. She had met the man waiting for her in her apartment only once, but she had never forgotten him, given the brutality of the threat he had leveled at her in that one meeting, a threat delivered with the same level of heartless detachment one might expect from a machine going through its programmed motions. Moving as quietly as she could, she approached the kitchen entryway, pausing by the small side table she had set next to it for her keys and wallet. The side table had a single drawer, which she quietly slid open, expecting there to be a small but efficient Beretta 9mm lying in wait for use within. When she looked down and found the drawer empty, she let out a tired sigh. "I also removed the snub nose in your bra and underwear drawer, Miss Martin," Mr. Gray said from out of view in the kitchen. Abigail stepped into her kitchen archway and looked at the small kitchen table in the middle of the room. The agent sat across from her in one of the two chairs she had in the kitchen, cigarette in hand, a small white collapsible travel ashtray open on the table, next to her two firearms. "It was clever, getting yourself a job with the company at the one-stop center," he said, pausing to take a drag on his cigarette. He let out a long exhale, quirking an eyebrow at her. "How did you end up selecting Mrs. Hawkes's experience as the basis for you to test your bit of code?" "I patched in a back door that would allow me to access the center's daily uploads in a compressed time format on my own interface," Abigail replied as evenly as she could, though she felt her knees wanting to buckle. From there, it was just a matter of finding the most hostile emotional experience that didn't devolve into intangible action at the moment. Mr. Gray took one last drag on his smoke, crushed it out in his travel ashtray, clapped it shut, and tucked it into a pocket of his suit blazer. "Sarah Hawkes, in other words," Mr. Gray observed. "You finally managed to figure out the code for amplifying emotional impulses on the recipient end." She just nodded. "And you used the people of this city as test subjects." Slower this time, but again, a nod. "Please, have a seat. Walk me through it," he said, folding his hands in his lap and adjusting himself in his seat so that he was faced directly across from the chair on her side of the table. Abigail put her purse over on the kitchen counter and then came over to the table, sitting down across from Mr. Gray, prepared to explain the exact methodology she had employed to figure out the necessary programming that would amplify subjects' aggression impulses. However, as soon as she sat down, Mr. Gray, who had used his movement to conceal himself putting on black latex gloves, shifted forward with her Beretta in his hand, the barrel pressing against her temple, and pulled the trigger once. After she fell over with a clatter of the chair on the floor, he pressed the gun into her hand, including ensuring that her pointer finger coiled all the way around the trigger enough to leave a print. Then he placed it a few inches away from her limp hand to effect a natural release. Mr. Gray left the expertly crafted suicide note in the pocket of her trousers, eased his chair in under her little kitchen table, and left. His job here was done. As for Sarah Hawkes, while his employers understood the potential risk she faced in being connected to one Candace Mitchell, the last recorded person to access the altered experience file from 1 Mile Shoes archives, they saw no reason to reach out to her. As far as she was to be concerned, she was just a blameless victim in Abigail Martin's schemes. One might wonder how a man like Mr. Gray could work for such an organization, could do the things that he did with such cold, ruthless calculation. Certainly, I wouldn't blame anyone for wondering about that. But how could we ever know? After all, how can we ever truly empathize with someone fully unless we tried walking a mile in their shoes? Thus concludes 1 Mile Shoe, a tale by yours truly, Joshua T. Calkins Truergy. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I ask that you take care of yourselves, and as always, keep reading.